A woman twice his size stepped off the wagon. Though the loner rancher was only expecting his mail-order bride, Jake Brennan stood at the train station with his hat pulled low, watching the dust settle from the incoming locomotive. His hands trembled slightly as he held the worn photograph of Margaret, his mail-order bride. She looked delicate in the picture, with soft features and a gentle smile. He'd written to her 3 times, and her letters back had been kind, measured, and full of hope for their new life together. The Kansas wind whipped around him as passengers began stepping down from the cars. He searched each face, looking for the woman who would become his wife. The station platform emptied quickly. Families reunited, businessmen hurried toward town, and still Jake stood there, confused and worried. Had she changed her mind? Had something happened during the journey? Then he heard the heavy footsteps. From the freight car at the rear, a woman appeared, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. She was massive, easily 6 feet tall and broad as a barn door, with arms like tree trunks and hands that could probably snap a man's neck. She wore a simple dress that strained at the seams, and her face was weathered and hard, with sharp eyes that swept the platform like a hawk searching for prey. She spotted him immediately. Her gaze locked onto the photograph he held, and she strode toward him with purpose. Jake wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to mount his horse and ride back to his ranch and pretend this day had never happened. But his boots felt nailed to the wooden planks beneath him. "You Jake Brennan?" Her voice was deep and rough, like gravel being crushed underfoot. "Yes, ma'am," he managed, his own voice sounding thin and weak in comparison. "I'm Margaret." She grabbed his hand in a grip that made his bones creak. "We getting married today, or what?" Jake stared up at her, his mind racing. This couldn't be the same woman from the photograph. That woman had been small, delicate. This woman looked like she could wrestle bears for entertainment. But the name was right, and she knew his name, and she'd come all this way expecting to be his wife. Yes, he stammered. "The preacher's waiting at the church." Margaret nodded once, then turned and hauled 2 massive trunks from the freight car as if they weighed nothing. Jake rushed to help, but she waved him off with one hand while balancing both trunks on her shoulders. His horse, a usually calm gelding named Dust, took one look at Margaret and sidestepped nervously. "Dat your animal?" Margaret asked, eyeing the horse with what might have been amusement. "Yes. His name's Dust. He's scared of me." It wasn't a question. She set down the trunks and approached the horse slowly. Dust's eyes rolled white, but Margaret spoke in a low, soothing tone that Jake couldn't quite hear. Within moments the horse had calmed, nuzzling against her massive palm. Jake felt his world tilting sideways. Nothing about this day was going according to plan, and he had a sinking feeling that his quiet, solitary life was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Margaret turned back to him, and in her eyes he saw something unexpected. Beneath the hardness and the intimidating size, there was a flicker of vulnerability, quickly hidden but unmistakably there. She was as nervous as he was. The wedding was brief and awkward. The preacher kept glancing between Jake and Margaret with barely concealed shock. The witnesses, 2 shopkeepers Jake had asked to attend, whispered behind their hands. Margaret's voice boomed out her vows while Jake's came out as barely more than a whisper. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Margaret leaned down and kissed Jake's forehead, since reaching his lips would have required her to bend nearly double. The witnesses tittered. Jake's face burned with embarrassment. They signed the papers in silence, and then they were married, bound together by law and God and a series of decisions that had seemed so reasonable in letters exchanged across 1,000 miles. Outside the church, Jake helped Margaret load her trunks onto his wagon. Well, he tried to help. She did most of the lifting. The ride back to his ranch took 2 hours, and neither of them spoke. Jake didn't know what to say. His ranch house was small, built for one man living alone. He'd cleaned it as best he could, prepared the bedroom with fresh linens, and stocked the pantry with supplies. But looking at Margaret beside him on the wagon bench, taking up more than her share of space, he wondered if anything he'd prepared would be adequate. The sun was setting when they arrived. The ranch stretched out before them, 300 acres of grassland with a small herd of cattle grazing in the distance. The house was modest, just 4 rooms and a porch. Margaret studied it all in silence, her expression unreadable. Jake helped her down from the wagon, though she clearly didn't need assistance, and carried one of her trunks while she hefted the other. Inside, the house felt even smaller. Margaret had to duck to get through the doorway. She set her trunk down in the main room and looked around slowly. Jake waited, anxious for her reaction, but she said nothing. She just stood there, this enormous woman in his tiny house, and Jake felt the full weight of what he'd done. He'd married a stranger twice his size. A stranger who could probably break him in half if she took a notion to do so. And now they were alone together, with nothing but the Kansas darkness outside and years of life stretching ahead of them. Margaret turned to face him, and Jake saw that vulnerability again in her eyes. Stronger this time. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. Finally, she said, "The photograph wasn't me. I figured that out. It was my sister. She died 2 years back. I kept using her picture because..." She paused, her massive hands clenching and unclenching, "because nobody wants to marry someone who looks like me." The honesty hit Jake like a punch. He'd been so focused on his own shock and disappointment that he hadn't considered what this must be like for her. Margaret had traveled across the country to marry a man who'd taken one look at her and clearly wished she'd stayed home. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and uncertain futures. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of someone chopping wood. He stumbled out of bed, confused and disoriented. He'd slept in a spare room, giving Margaret the main bedroom as seemed proper on their wedding night. The house was cold, and frost covered the windows. He pulled on his clothes and stepped outside to find Margaret splitting logs with an axe. She'd been at it for a while, judging by the massive pile of firewood she'd already created. The axe rose and fell with mechanical precision, each swing splitting the wood cleanly. She'd changed into work clothes, a man's shirt and trousers that actually fit her frame better than the dress had. She noticed him watching and stopped, breathing hard, steam rising from her body in the cold morning air. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Figured I'd make myself useful." Jake looked at the firewood more than he usually split in a week. That's good work." Margaret nodded and set the axe aside. "I should make breakfast. Part of being a wife, I suppose." She walked past him into the house, and Jake followed. In the kitchen, she moved with surprising grace for her size, gathering ingredients and starting a fire in the stove. Jake sat at the small table and watched her work. She made flapjacks and bacon, strong coffee, and fried eggs. The portions were enormous. When she set his plate in front of him, there was enough food for 3 men. She sat across from him with her own plate, which held even more. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Then Margaret said, "I can leave if you want. Annul the marriage. I got enough saved to get back east." Jake looked up from his plate, surprised. "Is that what you want? I asked you first." He considered the question. Did he want her to leave? Yesterday he would have said yes without hesitation. But watching her now, this woman who'd woken before dawn to chop his firewood and make his breakfast, he wasn't so sure. She wasn't what he'd expected, but then again, his life out here rarely went according to expectation. "I married you," Jake said slowly. "That means something to me. If you're willing to stay, I'm willing to try and make this work." Margaret studied him with those sharp eyes, looking for deception or pity. She must have found neither because she nodded once. "All right, then. But we do this honest. No more lies between us." Agreed. "And I pull my weight. I'm not some delicate flower to be protected. I work." "I can see that," Jake said, glancing at the mountain of firewood visible through the window. Margaret almost smiled. "My pa owned a logging camp up in Oregon. I grew up working alongside the men. After he died, they didn't want a woman running things, so I sold out and came here looking for a fresh start." "Why a mail-order marriage?" She shrugged, her massive shoulders rising and falling. "Same reason any woman does it, I suppose. Wanted a home. Wanted a family. Wanted someone to share the burden of living with." Jake understood that. It was why he'd sent for a bride in the first place. The loneliness of ranch life ground a man down over the years. He'd wanted companionship, help with the work, maybe children eventually. He'd pictured a soft woman who'd keep the house and cook his meals while he handled the cattle and the land. Looking at Margaret, he realized he'd have to adjust those expectations considerably. "I got 300 acres, Jake said. 50 head of cattle right now, but I'm hoping to expand. There's a stream that runs through the property, good grazing land. It's hard work, though. Last winter I lost 10 head to cold and sickness. I'm not afraid of hard work. I can see that too." They finished breakfast, and Margaret cleaned the dishes with the same efficiency she'd shown chopping wood. Jake went out to check on the cattle while she unpacked her trunks. When he returned hours later, the house had been transformed. Everything was cleaner, more organized. She'd rearranged the furniture to accommodate her size, moving the table away from the wall and replacing his small chair with one from the bedroom that could support her weight. She'd also started working on the garden plot beside the house, turning over the soil despite the cold weather. "Getting it ready for spring planting," she explained when Jake asked. "You got seeds?" "Some. Not much variety." Good vegetables. Enough to feed us and sell surplus in town if the crop comes in strong. Jake nodded, impressed despite himself. Margaret wasn't just strong. She was competent, experienced, and forward-thinking. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. They worked from dawn until dusk, Margaret handling tasks that would normally require 2 or 3 ranch hands. She repaired the barn roof, fixed the broken corral fence, and helped Jake move the cattle to better grazing land. In the evenings, they ate together and talked about the work for the next day. The conversation was practical, focused, devoid of anything personal. They slept in separate rooms. They lived like business partners rather than husband and wife. The town noticed Margaret immediately when they went in for supplies. People stared, women whispered. Men looked at Jake with pity or amusement. Margaret ignored it all, walking with her head high, conducting her business with quiet dignity. But Jake saw the way her jaw tightened, the way her hands clenched when someone laughed a little too loudly as they passed. At the general store, the owner, a weaselly man named Pete Carson, couldn't contain his curiosity. "That's quite a wife you got there, Brennan," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's a good woman," Jake replied evenly. "Oh, I bet she is. Probably does the work of 3 men, eh?" Pete laughed at his own joke. Margaret was at the far end of the store examining fabric. Her back was to them, but Jake knew she could hear every word. He felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. "You got a problem with my wife, Pete?" The laughter died. Pete held up his hands. "No problem, Jake. Just making conversation. Then make it about something else." Jake paid for his supplies and left, Margaret following silently. In the wagon, she sat stiffly, staring straight ahead. "You didn't have to defend me," she said finally. "Yes, I did. You're my wife." A wife you didn't want. Jake pulled the wagon to a stop in the middle of the empty road. He turned to face her. "I didn't want a lot of things, Margaret. I didn't want to lose my parents to fever. I didn't want to spend 10 years building this ranch alone. I didn't want to be so lonely I'd write to a stranger and ask her to marry me. But I did all those things, and here we are. You're my wife. That means I defend you. That's how marriage works." Margaret's eyes were wet, though no tears fell. Nobody's ever stood up for me like that before. Then they were fools. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. Warmer, somehow. That night, Margaret made a special dinner, using ingredients Jake hadn't even known they had. After they ate, she said, "I need to tell you something about why I really came here." Jake waited, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to say. "I told you my pa owned a logging camp. What I didn't tell you is how he died. There was an accident. A tree fell wrong, and he was in the way. But it wasn't really an accident." She paused, her face hardening with memory. "There was a man, Cal Henderson, who wanted to buy the camp cheap. Pa refused. After Pa died, Cal came sniffing around, trying to pressure me into selling. When I refused, things got ugly. He sent men to threaten me. Burned down one of the bunkhouses. I knew I couldn't fight him forever, so I sold to someone else, took less money just to spite Cal. Then I left Oregon fast because I knew Cal wasn't the forgiving type." Jake absorbed this information slowly. "You think he might come after you?" "I don't know. Probably not worth his time now. But I wanted you to know the truth. If trouble follows me here, you have a right to know why." "Trouble follows everybody out here sooner or later," Jake said. "At least yours has a name." Margaret smiled. A real smile this time, and Jake felt something shift between them. They weren't strangers anymore. They weren't quite partners yet either, but they were moving in that direction. The nights grew colder as winter deepened. Jake woke one morning to find Margaret had moved her blankets to the main room, sleeping by the fire. When he asked why, she said the bedroom was warmer and he needed it more than she did. He argued, but she was immovable. Eventually, Jake gave up. He learned quickly that arguing with Margaret was like arguing with a mountain, pointless and exhausting. Winter brought challenges that tested both of them. A blizzard struck in early December, trapping them in the house for 3 days. They rationed supplies and took turns keeping the fire going. The cattle huddled together in the lee of the barn, and Jake worried they'd lose animals. When the storm finally broke, they dug their way out to find 2 feet of snow covering everything. Margaret helped him check on the herd. Miraculously, all the cattle had survived, but the barn roof had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. They spent the next week repairing it, working in brutal cold with numb fingers and aching muscles. Margaret never complained. She just worked steady and strong, and Jake found himself grateful for her presence in ways he couldn't quite articulate. One night, as they sat by the fire warming their hands, Margaret said, "You ever think about what your life would be like if I hadn't come?" Jake considered the question. Probably the same as before. Alone. Working myself to death slowly. "You think you'd be happier?" "No," Jake said, surprising himself with the honesty. "I don't think I would be." Margaret looked at him with those sharp eyes, and Jake saw something new in them. Not vulnerability this time, but warmth. Maybe even affection. The stranger rode into their property on a cold January morning, his horse leaving deep tracks in the snow. Jake was in the barn when he heard Dust whinny nervously. He stepped outside to see a man he didn't recognize sitting tall in the saddle, scanning the property with calculating eyes. The stranger was dressed too well for a drifter, with a long coat and expensive boots. A gun hung at his hip, worn with the casual familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. Margaret emerged from the house, and the stranger's eyes locked onto her immediately. His expression changed, hardening into something mean and satisfied. "Well, well," the stranger said, dismounting slowly. "Margaret Sullivan. Or is it Margaret Brennan now?" "Heard you got yourself hitched." Margaret's face had gone pale. "Cal." Jake's stomach dropped. "Cal Henderson. The man from Oregon. The man who'd driven Margaret away from her home." Cal smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Didn't think I'd let you go that easy, did you?" "You cost me a lot of money, Margaret. Sold that camp to Andrew Morrison for half what it was worth just to spite me. That's not good business." "The camp was mine to sell," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear Jake could see in her eyes. "You got no claim on it or me. I got a different perspective on that." Cal's hand drifted closer to his gun. "See, your pa owed me money. A lot of money. Gambling debts. When he died, those debts passed to you. I figure you owe me about $5,000 plus interest." "That's a lie," Margaret said. "My pa never gambled." "You got proof of that?" "Because I got signed markers with his name on them." Cal pulled papers from his coat. "All legal and proper. So here's how this works. You come back with me, work off the debt however I see fit, or I take this ranch as payment." Jake stepped forward, putting himself between Cal and Margaret. "This ranch isn't hers to give. It's mine. And you're trespassing. Get off my property." Cal looked at Jake as if noticing an insect. "This doesn't concern you, little man. She's my wife." "Everything about her concerns me." Cal laughed. "Your wife? You married this monster. What's wrong with you?" The insult hit Jake like a physical blow, but not because it hurt him, because he could see it hurt Margaret. Her face crumpled for just a second before she hardened it again, and Jake felt rage boiling up inside him, hotter than anything he'd ever felt. "You need to leave," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. "Right now, or what? You'll fight me?" Cal's hand rested on his gun now. "I'm a professional, boy. I've killed 6 men. You really want to try your luck?" Jake wasn't a gunfighter. He'd shot rattlesnakes and coyotes, but he'd never drawn on a man. His hands were shaking, but he held his ground. Behind him, he heard Margaret moving, and then she was beside him, holding the axe she'd been using to split kindling. "You want to kill someone, Cal, you better kill us both," Margaret said. "Because I'll bury this axe in your skull before you can get a second shot off." Cal's confidence wavered. He was fast, but Margaret was close, and an axe didn't need to be reloaded. He stepped back toward his horse, calculating odds. "This isn't over," he said. "Those debts are real. I got the law on my side. I'll be back with the sheriff and we'll settle this proper."
"You do that," Margaret said.
"Bring the sheriff, bring a judge. Bring whoever you want. My pa's will was filed proper in Oregon, and it shows the camp paid in full with no debts. You come back here with fake papers and threats, you'll find yourself in a cell." Cal mounted his horse, his face dark with anger. "You made a mistake crossing me, Margaret. Both of you did. He rode off, and Jake watched until he disappeared over the horizon. Then his legs gave out, and he sat down hard in the snow. The adrenaline drained away, leaving him shaking and cold. Margaret knelt beside him, her massive hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" "I thought he was going to kill me," Jake admitted. "He might have, if you'd been alone. But we weren't alone."
"We had each other."
She helped him to his feet, and they went inside. Jake made coffee while Margaret sat at the table, staring at nothing. Her hands trembled slightly, the first time Jake had ever seen her show physical fear. "He's not going to let this go," she said quietly. Cal's not the type to back down. Then we'll deal with it together. Jake, you don't understand what kind of man he is. He's connected. He's got money and influence. Those papers he showed might be fake, but he can probably get real ones made. He can buy judges, sheriffs, witnesses, and if that doesn't work, he'll just kill us and take what he wants. Jake sat across from her. So what do you want to do? I should leave. Go somewhere else. Disappear. That way he's got no reason to hurt you. No, Jake, be reasonable. I said no, Margaret. You're not leaving. We're married. We face this together, or not at all. Margaret looked at him with something like wonder. Why are you doing this? You barely know me. We've been married 3 months, and we don't even share a bed. Why would you risk your life for me? Jake didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he did, but it scared him to say it out loud. Somewhere in the last 3 months, Margaret had stopped being a stranger. She'd become someone he relied on, someone he respected, someone he cared about, maybe even someone he was starting to love, though that word felt too big and complicated to say just yet. Because you're mine, he said finally, and I'm yours. That's what marriage means. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and this time they fell. She reached across the table and took his hand in her massive one, and they sat there in silence. 2 people bound together by law and circumstance in something deeper that neither of them quite understood yet. Outside, the Kansas winter wind howled, and somewhere out there, Cal Henderson was planning his next move. But inside that small ranch house, Jake and Margaret held on to each other, and for the moment, that was enough. 2 days passed with no sign of Cal. Jake and Margaret worked the ranch, but the joy had gone out of it. Every sound made them jump. Every rider on the horizon sent Jake's hand to the rifle he now kept close at all times. Margaret moved through the days with grim determination, but Jake could see the strain wearing on her. On the 3rd day, they rode into town for supplies. The general store was busier than usual, and the conversations died when they entered. Pete Carson looked uncomfortable as they approached the counter. Jake, Margaret, he said nervously, I gotta tell you something. What is it? There's a man been asking questions about you, big fellow, well-dressed. Said he was looking into a legal matter. He talked to the sheriff, showed him some papers. Sheriff seemed to think they were legitimate. Jake's blood ran cold. What kind of papers? Debt papers. Claims Margaret's pa owed him money. Says the debt transfers to Margaret as next of kin, and since you and Margaret are married, that makes you responsible too. Sheriff says he's got to investigate, make sure everything's legal before he can decide what to do. Margaret's hands clenched on the counter. Those papers are fake, Pete. Maybe so, but they look real enough. This Cal fellow, he's got lawyers. He's got documents with seals and signatures. Sheriff's not sure what to believe. They bought their supplies in silence and left. On the ride back, Margaret said, he's building a case, making it all look legal so when he takes the ranch, nobody questions it. Can we fight it? Get our own lawyer? With what money? We're barely making ends meet as it is. A lawyer costs more than we can afford, and Cal can outspend us 10 times over. He'll drag this out until we're broke, then swoop in and take everything. Jake gripped the reins so hard his knuckles went white. There has to be something we can do. There is, Margaret said quietly. I can sign over my rights to everything. Divorce you. That way his claim is only against me, not you. You keep the ranch, and I disappear. He might chase me, but at least you're safe. I already told you that's not happening. Jake, be smart about this. I am being smart. You think Cal's just going to let me go if you leave? He knows I'll come after you. He knows I'll cause trouble. The only way he wins clean is if both of us are out of the picture. Margaret didn't argue because she knew he was right. They rode the rest of the way in heavy silence. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Jake said, Tell me everything you know about Cal, how he operates, what he wants, everything. Margaret thought for a long moment. Cal's smart, but he's arrogant. He thinks being rich and connected makes him invincible. He's used to people backing down when he pushes. He's also careful. He doesn't do his own dirty work if he can help it. He hires men to handle things. A careful coward. A careful coward, but yes. When I refused to sell, he sent others to threaten me. He didn't show his face until after my pa died and the camp was vulnerable. What if we could prove the papers are fake? How? We'd need the original documents from Oregon, and that would take weeks to get. Cal knows that. He's counting on us not having time to mount a defense. Jake paced the small room, thinking. There had to be a way out of this. Some angle they weren't seeing. Then an idea struck him. What if we don't fight legal? What if we fight dirty? Margaret looked up, interested. What do you mean? Cal's arrogant, right? He thinks we're helpless. What if we set a trap? Make him think he's won, draw him out, and then expose him. That's risky. Everything's risky at this point. They talked late into the night, forming a plan. It was desperate and dangerous, but it was better than sitting around waiting for Cal to destroy them. The next morning, Jake rode into town alone. He went to the sheriff's office and asked to see the debt papers Cal had filed. The sheriff, a tired-looking man named Bill Crawford, showed them reluctantly. I don't like this, Jake, Bill said. Something feels off about the whole thing. But the papers look legitimate, and I got to follow the law. They were good forgeries with official-looking seals and signatures, but there was one detail that caught his eye. The dates. The markers were supposedly signed 2 years ago, but one of them mentioned a business that Jake knew hadn't existed until last year. He'd read about it in the newspaper. It was a small detail, easy to miss, but it was proof the documents were fake. Bill, look at this marker. It mentions the Portland Mining Company. That company didn't incorporate until May of last year. This marker is dated 2 years ago. How could my father-in-law sign a debt for a company that didn't exist yet? Bill studied the paper and his expression changed. You're right. That's impossible. Cal made a mistake. He got sloppy. These papers are forgeries. I'll need to investigate this further. But if you're right, Cal Henderson is in serious trouble. Forging legal documents is a crime. Jake rode back to the ranch feeling hopeful for the first time in days. He told Margaret what he'd found, and she grabbed him in a hug so tight his ribs creaked. You did it, she said. You actually found a way. We're not safe yet. Cal's still out there, and he's not going to take this well. They were right to be cautious. That night, Jake woke to the smell of smoke. He ran outside to find the barn on fire. Flames licked at the wooden walls, and the cattle inside were bellowing in terror. Margaret was already there, throwing open the barn doors and driving the cattle out. Jake grabbed buckets and started hauling water from the well, but the fire was spreading fast. They worked frantically, saving the animals but watching helplessly as the barn burned to the ground. By dawn, only charred timbers remained. Jake and Margaret stood in the ashes, exhausted and covered in soot. Then Jake saw them. 3 men on horseback, watching from the ridge above the ranch. One of them was Cal Henderson. They sat there for a long moment, making sure Jake and Margaret saw them, then rode away. The message was clear. This is just the beginning. Sheriff Crawford arrived later that morning with 2 deputies. He surveyed the burned barn grimly. This was arson. Somebody doused the walls with kerosene before lighting it. It was Cal Henderson, Jake said. I saw him and 2 others watching from the ridge. Can you prove it was them that set the fire? No. But who else would it be? Bill sighed. I believe you, Jake. I really do. But without proof, I can't arrest anyone. I've sent a telegram to Oregon requesting the original documents from your father-in-law's estate. Until I get a response, my hands are tied. Cal knows this. He's pushing, seeing how far he can go. He's trying to drive us off the land, Margaret said. Burn us out so we have nothing left to fight for? Probably. I'll post a deputy out here at night, keep watch. That might discourage him from trying anything else, but Jake knew 1 deputy wouldn't be enough. Cal had resources, men, money. If he wanted them gone, he'd find a way. That night, despite the deputy camped on their property, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound. Around midnight, he heard Margaret moving in the main room. He got up and found her sitting by the fire, sharpening a hunting knife. Couldn't sleep either? He asked. Keep thinking about what comes next. Cal's not going to stop. Even if the sheriff proves the documents are fake, Cal will just find another way to come at us. Men like him always do. Jake sat beside her. Maybe we should leave. Sell the ranch, start over somewhere else. Run away, you mean? Survive. There's no shame in that. Margaret set down the knife. I ran from Oregon. Told myself it was the smart thing to do. But it didn't matter. He found me anyway. Running doesn't work with men like Cal. They just follow until you can't run anymore. So what do? We fight. Properly this time. No more waiting for him to make the next move. She looked at Jake with fierce determination. Tomorrow, we're going to town. We're going to find Cal Henderson and have this out once and for all. Either he backs down or we make him. That's crazy. He'll kill us. Maybe, but at least we'll die on our feet instead of cowering in this house waiting for him to burn us out. Jake wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Margaret was right. They couldn't live like this, jumping at shadows, watching everything they'd built burn down piece by piece. Better to face Cal directly, whatever the consequences. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Jake cleaned his rifle and pistol. Margaret sharpened every blade in the house. They didn't talk about what might happen. There was nothing left to say. At dawn, they rode toward town. The January cold bit at their faces, but neither of them felt it. They were beyond cold now, beyond fear. They were riding toward whatever end this was going to have. They found Cal at the saloon, playing cards with 3 of his men. He looked up when Jake and Margaret walked in, and his expression shifted from surprise to amusement. "Well, look who grew a spine," Cal said, standing slowly. "Come to beg for mercy?" "Come to give you one chance to walk away," Jake said. "The sheriff knows your documents are fake. He's got proof." "You keep pushing this, you'll end up in prison." Cal laughed. "That tired old sheriff? He's got nothing. Even if he did, I got friends who'll make his evidence disappear. Face it, Brennan, you lost. Sign over the ranch and maybe I let you both walk away with your lives? Not happening." Cal's smile faded. "Then we do this the hard way." His hand moved toward his gun, and Jake knew he was too slow. He'd never beat Cal to the draw. But Margaret was already moving. She grabbed a table and flipped it into Cal's men, sending them sprawling. Then she was on Cal, her massive hand closing around his wrist before he could draw his weapon. She yanked him forward and slammed him against the bar. The impact knocked the wind out of him. "You want to threaten someone?" Margaret said, her voice low and dangerous. "Threaten me. Leave my husband alone." Cal's men were getting up, reaching for their guns. Jake drew his pistol and fired a shot into the ceiling. The saloon went silent. "Next person who moves gets the next bullet," Jake said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Sheriff Crawford burst through the doors, deputies behind him. "Everyone hold still!" He looked around the saloon, taking in the scene. "What's going on here?" "Cal Henderson tried to draw on my husband," Margaret said, still holding Cal pinned against the bar. "Self-defense." "That's a lie," Cal snarled. "I saw the whole thing," the bartender said. "The lady's telling the truth. Henderson went for his gun first." Bill looked at Cal with disgust. "Cal Henderson, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder and fraud." "Got a response from Oregon this morning?" "Those debt documents of yours are confirmed fakes. The real will shows no outstanding debts. You're done." Cal struggled, but Margaret held him firm until the deputies could get handcuffs on him. As they led him away, he looked back at Margaret and Jake with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. "Yes," Margaret said calmly. "It is." They walked out of the saloon into the bright morning sun. Jake's hands were shaking, adrenaline finally catching up to him. Margaret put an arm around his shoulders. "You all right? I fired a gun at people. I thought I was going to have to kill someone." "You kept your head. I'm proud of you." They rode back to the ranch in silence. When they arrived, they stood looking at the burned ruins of the barn. It would take months to rebuild, money they didn't have. Work on top of all the other work. But they were alive. They were together. And Cal Henderson was in a jail cell where he belonged. Jake turned to Margaret. "Thank you for everything. For standing with me. For being stronger than I ever could be." Margaret shook her head. "Strength isn't just about size, Jake. You stood up to Cal when you didn't have to. You defended me when the whole town was laughing. That takes a different kind of strength. The kind that matters." They stood there in the ruins of the barn, and Jake realized something. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped being a marriage of convenience. Margaret wasn't just his wife on paper. She was his partner, his friend. Maybe something more. The thought terrified him, but in a good way. "Margaret," he said quietly, "would you like to move back into the bedroom? We could share it." She looked at him with those sharp eyes, and slowly she smiled. "I'd like that." They walked into the house together, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the future didn't look like something to endure. It looked like something worth building toward. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the ranch. The snow melted, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. Jake and Margaret worked from dawn to dusk, rebuilding the barn, preparing fields, tending the cattle. The work was backbreaking, but they tackled it together. Margaret's strength made tasks that would have taken Jake weeks possible in days. She could lift beams Jake couldn't budge, haul materials that would have required a team of horses, and work for hours without tiring. But Jake brought his own skills to the partnership. He knew the land, understood the cattle, and had a head for the business side of ranching. Together they made a formidable team. The new barn rose slowly but steadily. Neighbors helped, barn raising being a community affair, and Jake was grateful for the assistance even if some of the men couldn't hide their amusement at his massive wife. Margaret ignored the whispers and jokes, working harder than any 3 men combined. By the time the barn was finished, even the skeptics had to admit she was an impressive woman. The town's attitude toward her began to shift, slowly but noticeably. Respect replaced mockery, at least among those who mattered. Cal Henderson's trial happened in March. Jake and Margaret rode to the county seat to testify. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers. Cal sat at the defendant's table looking smaller somehow, diminished. His lawyers tried every trick, but the evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents, the threats, the arson. Witnesses came forward, people Cal had bullied over the years, finally willing to speak up now that he was behind bars. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison. As they led him away, Cal looked at Margaret one last time. Whatever he saw on her face made him look away quickly. There was no more hatred there, just a woman who'd moved on, who'd won, who didn't need to think about him anymore. On the ride back, Jake said, "It's really over now." "Yes, it is." "What do you want to do next?" Margaret considered. "I want to expand the herd. Maybe get some chickens. Plant a bigger garden, build a life here. Sounds good to me." They rode in comfortable silence, and Jake marveled at how much had changed. The woman beside him had gone from a stranger he feared to someone he couldn't imagine living without. Her size no longer mattered to him. He barely noticed it anymore, except when he watched her work and felt grateful for her strength. What he saw now was Margaret, just Margaret. The woman who'd stood by him when leaving would have been easier. The woman who'd saved his life and his ranch.
The woman he loved. He hadn't said those words yet.
They felt too big, too important to say casually. But riding home through the spring sunshine, Jake promised himself he'd find the right moment. Soon. That moment came 2 weeks later. They were working in the garden, planting the seeds Margaret had brought from Oregon. The afternoon was warm, the first real heat of the year, and they'd shed their coats. Margaret was on her knees in the dirt, placing seeds with surprising delicacy given the size of her hands. Jake watched her work, struck by the simple beauty of the moment. This was his life now. This woman, this land, this shared purpose. "Margaret," he said suddenly, "I need to tell you something." She looked up, dirt smudged on her cheek. "What is it?" "I love you." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret's eyes widened, and for a moment Jake was terrified he'd made a mistake. That she didn't feel the same way, that he'd ruined everything by speaking too soon. Then Margaret smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. She stood, towering over him, and pulled him into an embrace that lifted his feet off the ground. "I love you too," she said into his hair. "I've loved you since the day you stood up to Cal Henderson for me. Since the day you chose me over your own safety. I just didn't think you could ever love someone like me. Someone like you?" Jake pulled back to look up at her face. "You mean strong and capable and brave? Someone who makes me laugh and makes me feel safe and makes every day better just by being in it? Margaret, you're exactly the kind of person anyone would be lucky to love." She kissed him then, bending down to reach him, and Jake kissed her back with everything he had. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing. They finished planting the garden together, working side by side as the sun descended toward the horizon. That night, they shared the bedroom properly for the first time, and Jake discovered that Margaret's strength came with surprising gentleness. She was careful with him, aware of the size difference in ways that made him feel cherished rather than fragile. They talked late into the night, sharing dreams and fears and plans for the future. Jake learned that Margaret wanted children. She was afraid she might not be able to have them, afraid that her size might make pregnancy dangerous, but she wanted them nonetheless. Jake wanted them too. He could imagine Margaret with a baby in her massive arms, rocking and singing. The image made him smile. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, her hand stroking his hair. "About how lucky I am?" "About how none of this went the way I planned, but it ended up better than anything I could have imagined." "You really mean that?" "Every word." They fell asleep tangled together, and for the first time in years, Jake slept without nightmares. The ranch prospered that summer. The cattle multiplied, the garden yielded an abundant harvest, and Jake and Margaret worked from dawn to dusk, building their life together. They added a room to the house, reinforcing the floor to support Margaret's weight. They bought a second horse, a massive draft animal that could carry her without strain. They made plans for the future. More land, more cattle, maybe some sheep. Jake taught Margaret to read the signs of weather and cattle sickness. Margaret taught Jake techniques she'd learned in the logging camps for moving heavy objects and managing large operations. They became true partners in every sense of the word. The town fully accepted Margaret by midsummer. The women invited her to church socials, though she had to stand in the back since no pew could comfortably fit her. The men asked her advice on construction projects and heavy work. Pete Carson at the general store started stocking items specifically for her, larger clothes and tools that fit her hands. Jake watched with pride as his wife moved through town with her head high, respected and valued for who she was. On their first anniversary, Jake gave Margaret a gift. It wasn't much, just a silver locket he'd bought from the traveling jeweler who passed through town every few months. Inside, he'd placed a tiny photograph of them together, taken by the photographer who'd set up shop briefly that spring. "I wanted you to have something that showed the truth," Jake said as Margaret opened the locket. "Not like that fake photograph of your sister. This is us."
Really?
Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the tiny image. There they stood, Jake barely reaching her shoulder, both of them smiling. It wasn't a picture anyone would call conventional or typical, but it was honest. "It's perfect," Margaret whispered. "Just like this life we've built." She put on the locket and never took it off. Years later, when their children asked about it, she'd tell them the story, how she'd come to Kansas expecting rejection and found love instead. How the small man in the photograph had proven to be the strongest person she'd ever known. How sometimes the family you choose matters more than the one you're born into. But that was years in the future. On this day, Jake and Margaret simply held each other and watched the sunset paint the Kansas sky in shades of orange and gold. The ranch stretched out before them, a testament to their hard work and dedication. The future waited, full of challenges and joys they couldn't yet imagine. But whatever came, they'd face it together. The loner rancher and the woman twice his size. Husband and wife. Partners for life. And if anyone in town still found their relationship strange or amusing, Jake and Margaret didn't care. They'd found something rare and precious in each other, something worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth cherishing. Love doesn't always look the way people expect. Sometimes it comes in surprising packages, arrives on unexpected trains, and transforms lives in ways no one could predict. But when it's real, when it's true, when it's built on respect and trust and shared struggles overcome together, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. Jake knew that now. Looking at Margaret, seeing the love in her eyes, feeling her massive hand holding his with such care, he knew he'd received a gift greater than any he'd dared hope for. The mail-order bride he'd never expected had become the wife he couldn't imagine living without, and that made all the difference.